Bob is my favorite discovery of the last 2 years. Not only do I think this paper is outstanding, and I learned a great deal from it, but over the last 2.5 years, I have read, 20 Reinstein papers, and every one of them is a gem. Some of them are small gems. They may be the best. He's written about the recognition power. He's written about a general review of the Washington administration's exercise of powers. He's written a lot about foreign affairs. There are insights. He explains to me for the first time, how it can be that the receive ambassadors clause is a duty rather than a power. To whom is it a duty? Bob has an answer for this. So don't just read this paper. Go home and read many more. So this paper is about a problem, or at least the way he sets out the problem is that there are a number of generally accepted, more or less uncontroversial national powers that are not easily explained using the standard McCulloch necessary and proper analysis. And he provides his own explanation for how to deal with this. But first, the middle section of the paper, which he didn't assign for us today, contains his refutation of a number of scholarly approaches, some from people, at least one, and maybe more from people around the table here today, but starting with William Winslow Crosskey in the 1950s, where the existence of these difficult-to-explain powers is taken as evidence that there must be some kind of a general, unlimited power in the national government to pursue the general welfare. I think these are the best parts of the paper. Part 3C, I especially like, where he gives, I think, a very rich discussion of the claim that we see mostly in late 19th century, early 20th century cases that powers can be derived of Congress or the president directly from notions of sovereignty. And he has, to my mind, an extremely persuasive series of responses, but also a rich description of the theory itself. I would really like to see John McKyle and Bob go, have a little real debate, because, I think Bob has very powerful counters to John's central thesis. And so forth. So that portion, but I can't spend much time on that since you haven't read those portions. So let me say I have two reservations about the paper. The first is that I think that the problem that he sets for us and that these other scholars have set is greatly exaggerated. Put me in the class of he calls these avoidance theory. I'm an avoidance guy. I just don't think that the problem is as big as he says. He identifies 9 powers that he says are extremely difficult to justify under McCulloch. Well, 3 of them I just think are plainly incidental powers and require no explanation at all. So can the government agencies enter into contracts? Well, of course they can. All corporations can do that. If there's no need to spell that out. That seems to me just obviously an incidental power. So also the power to sue in case the contracts are violated. He doesn't mention, but the power to own and use property would also be in this category too. The Constitution refers to disposing of property and regulating property, but not of actually owning property. I think that is also just plainly an incidental power. If anything is just follows under necessary and proper, it would be those. I would put in that category passports as well. There is no independent passport power. Passports are just a very convenient piece of paper that we use for diplomatic and trade and regulatory purposes, and the ability to issue a passport and service of those purposes is I think, just not difficult to explain. A second is the national foreign affairs power. I'm not going to talk much about that because I think Michael Ramsey and Sai Prakash have done very persuasive work talking about where those powers come from, largely through the vesting clause, and I can't add much to that. Maybe that's controversial, but if both Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton embrace the theory, I guess I'm going to stick to it. The next category, he talks about the immigration. The two powers are immigration and deportation. Now, last year we heard a paper here by Ilya Soman arguing that, in fact, the federal government does not have an immigration power. I responded to Soman then, and I do believe it's an implied power. Now, a slight quibble here is that Bob refers to this as the exclusive federal power. This power is not exclusive. The states exercise the immigration power with only the exception of the Alien Acts for the first 100 years of the Republic. Even the Supreme Court, in its, I think, ridiculously nationalistic decision in Arizona against the United States, didn't go so far as to say that the power over immigration is exclusive. But I also think but I think Soman and others are being very un-McCulloch-like in their narrow understanding of what is necessary and proper to other congressional powers here, that the connection between being able to regulate who's coming into the country and staying in the country with the naturalization power is, I think, quite clear. If we want to decide, if we have naturalization laws that say people who are here for 3 years or 7 years are going to become citizens, and we want to be able to control who that is, that's what immigration is for. I also think the Foreign Commerce Clause is a perfectly adequate power. Interestingly, in Arizona against the United States, the Supreme Court also refers to immigration powers as being implied from the general foreign affairs powers, which I think is really curious because that would mean they're presidential powers without any actions of Congress. I think Mr. Trump will be very interested to hear this if he reads Supreme Court opinions. I'm not sure if he does, but I would recommend that he tweet about that rather than some of the other things he's been tweeting about that have less validity to them. The recognition power. Bob is, I think, our greatest scholar on the recognition power already, but there are any number of powers to which this is connected, and I think Bob and I agree that we, in fact, under international law and in U.S. practice, we recognize foreign nations in a variety of different ways. It can be done by treaty. It can be done by the sending and receiving of ambassadors. It can be done through declarations of war and exercise of other war powers. It can be done in the course of regulating trade. And when we recognize other governments in the course of doing those things, the powers are clearly implied from clearly enumerated authorities, and we don't need a fancy theory for that. Legal tender laws are really tough, but they're not tough because of a lack of any plausible source of power. Of course, if Congress can borrow money, it can issue notes, and it would be very convenient to require people to use them for legal tender. The reason the legal tender cases are difficult is because it may have been an inappropriate power because the framing generation didn't approve of it, and I think there were assurances to the people that it wouldn't be exercised. But it's not a sort of classic sort of McCulloch issue at all. And then the final example, Congress's contempt powers, I just think should not be on the list. the reason why cases like Dunn versus Anderson, which Bob discusses, are controversial is not a lack of power, it's lack of due process and the lack of the existence of a statute. If Congress simply passed a statute saying, making it a crime to disrupt congressional meetings, nobody would even think twice about that being necessary and proper. The peculiar thing is that Congress has declared itself to be judge and jailer, and throws people, locks people up in the basement of Congress with no due process at all. That's what makes that power so odd. It's not a McCulloch power. So I think the problem here is greatly exaggerated, and in fact, maybe there isn't any problem at all. But I still want to commend Bob's solution to the problem, but not because it corrects an error in McCulloch, but because at least it's new to me, and I think it is an illuminating and insightful way of thinking about how the reasoning in McCulloch actually worked, how Hamilton actually argued. And, I taught McCulloch just last week, and I found myself talking to my students about McCulloch precisely in the way Bob tells us to, which is to say that we shouldn't play divide and conquer with each individual power. So what Jefferson does in his opinion on the bank is he takes each thing, taxing, we don't really need a bank for that. Raising armies, we don't really need a bank for that, and goes down the list. And what Hamilton does that I had not seen before, and that Marshall does, and I hadn't seen before Bob's excellent paper, is that the aggregation of powers is another way to think about how to do this. That is to say, when you look at the powers as a whole are in fact greater than the sum of their parts. I think his discussion of the four clusters of powers and where those four clusters, the sort of deep origins of those four clusters is extremely powerful, insightful, helps us understand why the Constitution is the way it is. But my friendly suggestion to Bob is that he not claim that this is an alternative to the classical McCulloch analysis. What he has provided is an excellent, fresh, insightful way of understanding what classical McCulloch analysis looked like at the time and how we ought to be talking about it today.